Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Madden. I teach piano pedagogy here at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and I am thrilled to be interviewing Bob Weirich this morning, who we just happen to live 15 minutes apart in Kansas City, and we thought we would make this a little bit more personal this morning by actually doing it in the same room. So welcome, Bob. And,
welcome here.
Yeah, we're looking forward to talking a little bit about his book.
Yeah, and we do want to hope it can be a conversation, not too planned out ahead of time. And you've got the chat possibility to ask us questions either as you think of them, or they can be gathered up at the end of the whole session.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, just to get started, I thought we'd ask some general questions about the book. So what was the impetus for starting these columns whenever you wrote them? I mean, it's from over a long period of time. And how did you envision that readers would interact with them?
Well, I thought as I wrote them that they were, in a way, a conversation with the reader. I wanted to show my openness to whatever it was I was writing about, and it kind of invited the listener or the reader to think for themselves of, well, how would they answer that question?
Yeah.
Everything has to start at the beginning. So the first part of the book glances at my own beginnings as a musician and teacher. And then the story of how the columns, and it also includes partly how did the columns get started. In fact, I think I can read a bit of something there for you that talks about exactly that. The columns were essentially essays, by their very nature, momentary bursts, little explosions of personal insights shared with readers I could only imagine. The term comes from the French essayer, to attempt or try. And indeed, these essays are attempts at saying something that mattered deeply to my interior world when they were written. Time passed between essays, sometimes a month, sometimes a couple of years. Time has certainly passed since the 1950s, my childhood, to these days of retirement. Rediscovering the essays, I recognize each as an attempt to shine a light down a path, uncertain where it might lead. Those moments are now past, yet rereading many of them today, I recognize their prescience. As the winds of change blow, we are not out of the woods yet. That's a play on words in terms of the titles of the columns. It's opened with a view from the second floor. I think it was The View from the Second Floor, which started in 1984. And then Out of the Woods, 1994. Mm-hmm. And then Winds of Change, 2009.
Okay, yeah.
The essays are presented here under subject groupings rather than chronologically. I precede them with an introduction or prelude written with the wisdom of hindsight to set the stage. Interludes may connect chronologically disparate pieces, and a postlude may follow to offer a final word. These thoughts span 40 years. Eesh, how did that happen? It is only now that I can draw lines one to another to make the connections that have lurked there all these years. And I hope the reader finds the journey rewarding.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the things that I really enjoy about this book is that we really get this broad perspective from over 40 years, as you said. And so it's really interesting to see how things change. And as we get into some of the more detailed content of the chapters later in the interview, I think we'll see how your perspective has changed. So in our conversations, just personally, you've mentioned that you gradually became more comfortable with the idea that the book would be autobiographical, but you sort of resisted the word autobiography for this book. So can you describe your thoughts around that?
Well, the original columns were often personal, so it was hard to avoid some autobiography. In organizing the book, I needed to write some new stuff to link them all. And that, of course, brings yourself into it again. And so there was a pull toward memoir or autobiography. But my simple life, I'm not a star, doesn't really deserve anything as highfalutin as autobiography.
Well, yeah.
But what I did realize was there are thousands of other people trying to do exactly what I did over those 40 years of making sense of what we do and does it have relevance and and how do we exist?
Yeah, totally. And that question of relevance is interesting, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. Just as a reminder, in the chat, I believe the Francis Clark Center has put the link to purchase the book with a discount code. So if you haven't done that yet, feel free to do that. So let's get to a little bit of content-related questions about the book. So before going into each individual chapter, I was wondering if you could give everybody sort of a broad overview of the columns throughout the book. And you mentioned sort of the dates and when each column began, but if you might go into a little more detail about that.
Well, they're all mixed up in the book. As I said earlier, they're not chronological. So it's a little hard to do that. But by subject matter, let me look at the table of contents.
Yeah.
I can tell you that there are 16 chapters altogether, and the chapters are subject related. And then within each chapter, there are reprints of the old columns, or essays, as I'm trying to call them now. And so we have things like beginnings, foundations, on becoming a performer, on becoming a teacher, and then chapter 5 is on my own teachers. Mm-hmm. Then chapter 6 is pedagogical confessions. I don't know if I should say this aloud on the web, but I never took a pedagogy course.
Yeah.
And then chapter 7 is called the question of sustainability. Can we, in fact, keep doing this? And so forth. It's that kind of thing. The last chapter is completely new. There's nothing reprinted there, simply called The Next Chapter.
Yeah.
And it tries to guess of how do we, in fact, keep this going.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I love that you sort of gave us an overview of the chapters, because even just looking at the table of contents, one of the big themes is teaching and teachers and your pedagogy experience, even though you never took a class, right? Yeah. But you turned out just fine, I think, right? Yeah. But
I'm from a pedagogy major.
That's right, yeah. But so yeah, several chapters relate to teaching. So like in chapter 4, you describe your journey to becoming a teacher, as well as grappling with the question, why do I love to teach? And there's a story behind that question, right? Sure. And I was wondering, and then you describe your own teachers, and if you could talk a little bit about the answer to that question, and if your teachers had anything to do with how you answer that question.
Okay, that's several strains there. The reason for writing a 3-part essay called Why I Love to Teach came about through the interview I took for the job at Peabody in 1985. And the dean saw my masterclass, and in the interview she said, "Why do you love to teach?" And I couldn't really answer. I just knew I enjoyed it. And so I thought about it a lot and did a lot of reading, and that's what produced that series of essays that did get published as A View from the Second Floor in around 1986. Mm-hmm. My own teachers, though, all of them loved to teach in different ways. And I know I picked up that joy from them. I can't define exactly what it was, but I certainly think they helped.
Yeah. Well, I think that comes across in your writings as well, your appreciation for your teachers.
Oh, thank you.
Which is,
Yeah, that's one of the longer chapters. I think there are 10 essays in there altogether.
Okay.
Not 10 different teachers, but...
Right. Yeah. Well, going on, earlier you said about sustainability, and that's a big topic that comes up, and it's something that I think we're always talking about in the arts even today, right? And so that's in chapter 7 about sustainability of the profession itself. And this, I believe the original, call it essay now instead of column, was from 1986. And so, here we are in 2024, and I'm wondering what your perspective is now, almost 40 years later, and have we sustained it? Is it still sustainable? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when you and I talked about organizing this webinar, that did come up. And so I looked into my book to find out, have I written anything about it since 1986?
Sure, yeah.
And well, yes, indeed.
Yeah.
There is that possibility. And let me just find that. Ultimately, how's that for a good word?
Yeah.
The big question is, why are so few children taking music lessons in the United States? Before lessons begin, parents must overcome significant impediments. Lessons require the investment of time. Parents also already overschedule their children if one is to believe the New York Times. And there was a recent article there about that exact subject. There is also the investment of money. While some parents will spend $1,000 a month for sports equipment and training, similar expenditures for music are rare. Is there a piano in the house? Is that piano in good shape? I personally do not think an electronic keyboard is a good substitute. In the long run, it's the organic materials like wood, felt, and ivory that make a deep connection as well as the natural, unsynthesized sound. The heyday of piano lessons was the 19th century. The instrument then was at the forefront of human technology. Today, its place is usurped by the iPhone, by Facebook and Instagram, by YouTube and TikTok. All these things become competition for the time one might spend with the piano. Perhaps the most daunting factor of all is that the parents themselves have probably not taken lessons. It has been decades since public school music has contributed to the intellectual and spiritual mores of that at least a generation of Americans. Parents don't know that their children are lacking something since they themselves never had musical experiences. The whole family simply doesn't know what it is missing. It's an uphill battle. Is it surmountable? Yeah, and that obviously is new writing. That bit ends with, only if music studies somehow becomes irresistible again. To answer that question, is it surmountable? Only if music studies somehow becomes irresistible again. That word irresistible may seem an odd adjective, but what came initially to mind was cool. And in looking up that word in the thesaurus, one finds only other out-of-date words. Great, swell, dandy, groovy, out of sight. This suggests how different it will be to make music study a necessary part of life. Otherwise, it becomes a niche hobby, which it already is. How sustainable can this be? So, as you see, I don't really have answers, but I do have the warning signs up.
Yeah, totally.
And I hope all of you listening have some ideas for yourself.
Yeah, it's really interesting, this idea of generational and piano lessons. You know, my parents both took piano lessons, and so it was a bit more natural that then I would take piano lessons. But I think as the generations go down, that's not always true. It's not always being passed down. And I think it's almost like people who speak two languages, if they come to this country and then their kids maybe do that, but then their kids don't. And it's sort of, right? So how do we sort of change this trend?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It takes a concerted effort.
It takes an effort, yeah. Now you've got me thinking about, where has piano become irresistible in our culture today? I wonder if there are examples of that. Can you think of any? Or, I mean, because it's such a great word to use.
Well, I think among an elite kind of player, they have it, but it is such a small group.
Right.
It's not a generalized kind of thing. I mean, I'm not looking for everyone to turn into the next Yu Zhuang.
Sure.
I would be more interested in them turning into an amateur who loves music, who finds joy in playing every day for themselves.
Yeah.
And sharing that with a small group of other people.
Yeah.
And if you do that enough times in every community in the country, you've got a more viable society going.
Yes, totally. And that kind of gets at an interesting angle with sustainability that you talked about, which was sort of through the lens of politics in one of your chapters. And you talked about local and how, like politics, a lot of it happens locally. And can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a phrase I heard once at a convention of the Chamber Music America group. And one of the speakers said, all arts, like politics, is local. And I just thought, well, that's a catchy phrase. And when you think of politics, I mean, you can look at the presidential race, and it seems to be up to now only 6 or 7 states. But in the meantime, there are local offices, and what gets done at your community to fix the roads, to pick up the garbage, whatever it takes, that's a local function. And you've got to think about that stuff. It doesn't just happen by itself.
Yeah.
So again, for the arts, it's thinking about what happens locally, what can you do to enhance that or enjoy it, even just to support it is very important.
Yeah. You know, another word you used in your last response was amateur. And that's actually a portion of the book as well. You go a little bit into, you know, the root of that word and what it means to you. And so I wonder, I think that's really important. Just maybe people know that, or maybe they don't, just to remind them, or what are your thoughts on that word?
From the Latin amor, and it means love. And something you love, you give time to. You look for ways to extend it. And more power to the amateurs, what I say.
Totally, yeah. So going on to something else besides sustainability, in chapter 11 you talk about another topic that we all talk about, which is burnout. Yes. And so I think it's not only something we talk about, but I think it's something we all deal with at some point in our careers. And so I wonder if you feel comfortable describing your experience with that feeling throughout your career and how you overcame it.
Well, no, I don't feel comfortable. But that chapter is called Fighting the Good Fight, I think.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of chapters there on simple problem that all musicians face, pianists anyway, memorization, to memorize or not to memorize.
Sure.
And it's a battle. And then there were a couple of other columns, old essays about it'll come to me in a minute. Senior moment here. The criticism, of course.
Right.
What we all look forward to, being criticized. And, you know, there could be friendly criticism and not so friendly criticism. And there's a chapter on each of those. Then about burnout, you know, that often it happens if you don't take care of it when it first rears its head.
Yeah.
And in my case, I could have lost my career really at a time that I was just really kind of wrapped up in a lot of different problems. And so I had written about them 20 or more years ago, and I now think, okay, that's out there. I might as well put that in the book, and again, let people reading it weigh their own problems and think about how they continue to live as a musician.
Yeah. You know, part of that is memorization that you said when you were talking about that. There were two parts where you talked about memorization. Wonder, you know, how have your thoughts on that topic evolved over the years? And do you see, have you evolved on that topic? And then do you see the sort of classical piano music culture evolving on that as well?
Well, it does seem that more artists are using iPads on their, and that allows them to play so many more pieces. So their repertoires are huge. And I don't have a problem with that at all. Here in town, not long ago, Richard Good was here and played the Diabelli Variations. And he used the music for the whole program. And I didn't mind it a bit because it was just such great playing.
Yes.
And I think that, of course, is the challenge. And even still, if I can do it by memory, I will. But I also, just as I was having trouble finding that word a minute ago, the brain kind of does its thing as one gets older, and you can't really help it.
Yeah.
So why not read the music and not have to worry about it so much? Yeah,
you know, and I think it's interesting what you say about it allows you to have such a bigger repertoire and be able to play more pieces and probably more often, which goes back to what you were saying about things being local and just doing concerts, even if it's for a small number of people. It seems to me sometimes that not memorizing things allows you to do more of that, which is such an important thing.
Right. That's a good point.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so going to chapter 12, which I think is really an interesting one, you draw on a quote by Bill Zinsser. And the quote, the essence of it is that the best way to learn something is to write about it, which I think is perfect since we're talking about, this book here, right? Tons of writings in this book. So what have you learned from writing about all of these topics that appear in the essays?
Well, I hope it shows up in the essays.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But you mentioned Bill Zinsser. William Zinsser was a professor of writing at Yale, and wrote several books on writing. And I quote his book "Writing to Learn" in here. I think you've already mentioned that. Let me read a little bit of the beginning of that chapter. I think it'll answer your question best. So that chapter begins with a question. Why write? Answer, to communicate. Communicate what? Many things, not the least of which is inner experience. Why share self-reflection? To find out what you really think. To be honest with yourself, and in so doing, perhaps lead a reader to a bit of self-evaluation. The word communicate has appeared often in previous chapters. It has usually dealt with musical communication, the passing on of the performer's experience of a composition to an audience of one or many. One hopes for revelation, for performers that the music can be revealed in a public situation, for listeners that something might touch an inner nerve previously unknown to them. Writing is not so different from what musicians hope for in performing. I have previously admitted to a strong early inclination toward literature, so communicating by the written word has, for me at least, its root at the same desire for interpersonal communication as music making. Skip a paragraph. I can see now that the clavier essays were attempts to learn about self, career, teaching. Sharing them with the magazine's readership required a willingness to say, I don't know, but I'm trying. It's not unlike a performance that hasn't quite gelled yet.
Yeah. I love this topic of writing, and the longer I teach pedagogy, the more I think about writing and how it relates to teacher training. And I think I always include more and more writing in my pedagogy courses now, actually.
Yeah.
And I don't mean, 15-page papers. I mean, we're going to watch a clip of a lesson, and you're going to write very specifically exactly what you would say to that student in 50 words or less. And I think that, it's important. What comes to mind is Bob Duke, Intelligent Music Teaching. I think the first chapter of that is precision in language and thought.
Yeah.
And, I always say to students, if you can't watch this teaching clip and in 50 words say a very coherent thing that you would say to this student, what's going to come out of your mouth spontaneously as you're trying to teach a student?
Right.
It's just going to be too many words and a bunch of nonsense that doesn't string together. And it seems to me, I don't know if you have thought about this in your teaching, but if you can't write something clearly, you're certainly not going to be able to speak it spontaneously as with teaching clearly.
Yeah. That first pedagogy conference I went to, the whole subject was observation and how one has to kind of get past your preconceptions of what's wrong and observe what's really there, and again, then bring it into words.
Yes.
And that was a turning point for me, really.
Yeah, yeah. And that's actually, you talk a little bit about what included in the book is part of your experience at that NCKP conference. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about that, because was that your first one that you had attended? Or?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. I don't know how honest to get here.
Yeah.
Let me look at the time. Oh, we're doing okay.
Yeah, we've got, yeah.
Someone encouraged me to write a paper to turn into them, and I wrote about watching a session at MTNA where student teachers taught real students, and then pedagogy teachers taught the teachers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I thought it was all wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I thought the things they were observing were not the right things to catch. I had my problems with the whole program. And so I wrote a paper about that and sent it in. And my God, it got accepted.
Yeah.
So then I had to read it.
Yeah.
And by this time I had gone through 3 days of real learning from my part of just what can go on in learning about the art of teaching. And so I had to rewrite the whole paper.
Okay.
And that is what ended up in the proceedings, if anybody really wants to do their homework.
Yes.
But there was an in-between one, and that's what I printed in the book.
Oh, okay, got it. Yeah.
So there's a little bit of still irritation with the whole thing, but then an admission that, oh, hey, yeah, this is something you can do. And I think that paper ends with in all ways, it ended with the idea that pedagogy teachers and performance teachers really need to talk to one another and to learn from one another. And it would not be such a bad idea for them to sit down and play the Schubert Fantasy in F minor or something together on the same piano.
Yeah.
To learn. Ultimately, it's about music making, and then the performance teacher can learn how to be more efficient and maybe honest in their teaching through the pedagogy teacher.
Yeah. It occurs to me that as somebody who teaches applied lessons and a pedagogy class that teaching piano effectively is such a different skill set than teacher training. Teaching people how to teach. Totally different task, right? Very challenging. So I love this idea, though, about music making together, sitting down and just playing duets and then talking through various performance issues or teaching issues with that duet. I think it's a great idea.
Thanks. Yeah. We had done that, actually, in my very early days at Northwestern. Fran Larimer was the pedagogy teacher there, a storied person in the field. And she and I played a duet together, a Mozart duet, in a program that the whole piano faculty went together on to play four hands and two pianos and that kind of thing.
Right, yeah. Oh, that sounds great.
It was fun.
Yeah. Well, I know every time I've played with colleagues at UMKC, it's we do duo piano things or whatever. It's always a lot of fun. Yeah, it's really great. Yeah. By the way, so I see there was one question in the chat already about the discount code, and that was answered. So yes, the discount code is available to everybody, so feel free to use that. And then I would just encourage you, if you have any questions as we're having this conversation, feel free to put it in the chat. We have somebody that's thankfully very helpful. They're taking those questions out of the chat and sending them directly to us. So we would love to see questions coming in, and we can address those as we go along here. So, towards the end of the book, one of the you addressed actually two questions that I feel like are somewhat related because they both deal with relevance. First is the relevance of our discipline, and then second is the future of our discipline. And I wonder if you might be able to share your thoughts on these topics.
Well, as I put the book together and reread the old columns in no particular order, I found that, if I had to put a subject matter on this book, it would be relevance. How is what we do relevant to the society, and how is the music we teach and play relevant? And that's a hard one. It's a very squishy matter. In fact, my note here. That chapter 15, there's 8 different essays on it, on relevance. And a lot of them came from the period when I was writing The Winds of Change. So I was aware of change and how we have to change in order for things to indeed be relevant. So some of those columns, I think, are some of my favorites. There's one that takes off on something Maureen Dowd wrote in the New York Times, and another one takes off on a documentary that Al Pacino did about playing Richard III.
Yeah.
How do you make that relevant?
Yeah.
And I just loved that whole idea. And that's a pretty good column, I think. And the last one in that chapter is called The Activist Artist. And notice the order of that. Not,
sure.
not the artist citizen, which Joe Polizzi's book, but I think in a way we have to think about being an activist first and artist, not second, but that is, if we're an activist, we may have a reason to be an artist.
Yeah. Well, and those are two words that I feel like people don't always associate in the same sentence, activist and artist, right?
Sure.
So have you viewed yourself as an activist artist in various stages throughout your career? And if so, like, is there a specific example where you left a certain gig or something and you thought, I'm an activist and I'm an artist?
Well, when I was the music director of the Skaneateles Festival in upstate
That's
New York,
right, yeah.
There, Skaneateles is a town of about 2,000, maybe 2,500, and it's a well-off community in that it is lying on a very picturesque lake in upstate New York. It's a music festival there that started with their bootstraps and it turned into a very meaningful pursuit by both those doing the playing and the community really rallied around it. And how do you make that happen? And it takes people. It takes a core group that work together and in some ways unfailingly without looking for recompense themselves. But it's contagious.
Yeah, sure.
It's contagious. And so there, if I were an activist, it was the idea of taking that group and giving them some pretty hard music to listen to, some really contemporary things.
Yes.
I remember one concert we did a long piece by the Polish composer Górecki.
Okay. Yeah.
And someone came to me after that and said, I hated that piece, but I'm really glad I heard it.
Yeah, sure.
And so there's how the art, the music itself, can expand the mind of an open listener.
Yeah.
And so it was to develop open listeners.
Yeah.
That I think was my job there as an activist.
Yeah, and I mean, activism is contagious, right? And so it sounds, yeah. So I love that concept.
That festival is still going on.
Yeah.
It's past 40 years now.
Great, yeah.
And it's in very good shape.
Great, yeah. Well, we have questions coming in, which is great. So I'll just go from the top. Yeah. So first question is from Mauricio. In your opinion, how important is it that a teacher still perform before an audience? Interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I want your answer on that.
Yeah, you know what? I saw that come in and I thought, I think about this a lot, right? Because I think there's different teachers will offer different perspectives based on their experience, right? So I think a teacher who is actively performing is going to give a student a certain experience and perspective that might be different from a teacher who actively performed for a very long time and then just has it. For whatever reason, Leon Fleischer, for example, right? Going to be a different perspective. Played a lot, didn't play for a while, great teacher. So I think sometimes I think, it's possible to not be performing for an audience, but still offer a unique perspective for a student because maybe you're playing every day. And so there's a difference in my mind sometimes between playing and performing before an audience. That's why I think that
the audience part
is interesting. And then the last thing I think is I always think about, in some way performing is an athletic feat, right?
Yeah.
And so to use a Kansas City reference, the Chiefs, right?
Yeah.
I look at these coaches at a very high level. Andy Reid, for example, in Kansas City, right? Andy Reid, I don't think could go out and do much of what the Chiefs do, right? He likes his cheeseburgers for sure, right? He's kind of known for that here. But there's an example of somebody who's coaching or, in my opinion, teaching at a very high level, right? Who really can't do anything that his players are out there doing, right? And so I often think, well, how did he get to that point? And it's studying the game, knowing the strategy. And I wonder, if there's an analogy there in piano teaching to a certain extent. I mean, of course, you have to know how to play, right? But I wonder your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting line there. Personally, I think maybe when you are younger, well, let me back up. Again, with the Standing Atlas Festival, my first 3 years of being the music director, I planned programs that had overall subjects or guidances. The first year we called the Year of the Composer, and because the composer makes the music, and we as performers have to understand it, and we have to be the advocate for the composer. And so in that series of 4 weeks of concerts, we had 4 different composers that we featured. Not doing one piece by a modern composer, but by doing a whole weekend of things by that composer, at least 3 pieces. The next year, what we called the Year of the Performer, and we emphasized the whole idea that the performer is the one that brings the music to the audience. And some of the cool things about being a performer. And then the third year was the Year of the Listener, because that is just as important as the other 2. Without the listener, you don't really have the act of music making. So to get to the question today, I think as a performer, one of the things you have to come to terms with is that audience and how they listen and what they listen to, and how easy do you make it for them to hear what you're trying to do and with the music. So I think it's important for a teacher of others who are going to perform to include the audience in the whole mix. Mm-hmm. That's a long answer to kind of roundabout in the end, but I think it's a 3-legged stool.
Sure,
yeah. And you need all 3 in order for the act to happen.
Yeah. And maybe, do you think it's different? Because I always think about the type of student you're teaching. You're saying people who are going to play for an audience versus if you're teaching an amateur who is doing it, for that love, like you were saying earlier. Is that maybe a different kind of teaching, or would they be better suited to have a certain kind of teacher, do you think, or?
I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
I was just glancing at the questions that are coming in, and I see a name there I recognize.
Yeah. Sure. Let's see which one. No, that's fine.
Sure I actually heard
No, that's okay.
question.
It's okay. We have a lot of questions. Which one? Who do you know? And I'll read that one.
Well, there's Trevor Thornton.
Yeah, there's Trevor. I see Trevor. Yeah,
But Jill Belmont is the one that I hit on there.
Okay.
Which chapter was the most difficult for you to write and
reveal? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Golly. Which was the most difficult to write? Jill, I'm not sure I would point to one. The last chapter was hard in that I was trying to foresee the future. Mm-hmm. And I don't have any idea if it's the right answer for the future. It's my answer. But in a way, what was difficult was taking all those old essays and old thoughts and trying to draw a line between them. And so it was to make the whole book that was the most difficult, how to form the whole out of many little parts.
Right, yeah, I can see how that would be challenging. And then interspersing it with the new writings, right? Yeah, structural challenge in a way. Yeah. Right. Quick question from Catherine, and then we're down to Trevor. Catherine just wanted to know, which book is The Activist Artist from?
I quote, Catherine, if you've read it already, you're probably referring to other quotations that I have within that chapter. But it's not from any one book. I mean, I quote John Dewey, right. Maxine Greene, Bronislaw Huberman. I do a lot of reading. How do I steal all my ideas from somebody else?
Yeah, if you haven't read this yet, I mean, that's one thing that comes across for sure is, how well read you are, but not only that, but your ability to sort of pull from all of those sources and put it into a unique perspective, which I think is, one of the best aspects of this book.
Thank you.
So, well, now Trevor has a question. So Trevor said he was moved by the chapter on Donald Currier and the parallels he sensed between how you describe his teaching and then his experience of working with you, which is very nice to say. And can you talk a little bit more about your experience studying with Mr. Currier and how it informed your teaching, consciously or otherwise?
Good question, Trevor, and thank you for comparing us. Don was the chapter about him, or the essay about him in the book, comes from an appreciation I wrote on his retirement from Yale several years after I actually studied with him. And I think that chapter does say the things that I thought were really great about him. One of them was how you could come to him and play a piece and you think you have a certain kind of problem. And then he starts talking about something totally different. And you know, okay, we'll go down that street for a while. And then you realize, oh, that original problem has disappeared. And I don't know how he did that. And if I was ever able to do that, I'm very happy. I don't know that I was. Only you can answer that one, Trevor.
Yeah. Well, that's a remarkable thing, as sometimes, you know, like Trevor even noted, I think, how it informed your teaching consciously or otherwise. I think sometimes with teachers, it's hard to really verbalize how exactly they do what they do. Mm-hmm. And often I find that you don't realize it until later, after you start exploring on your own after being a student, which is an interesting phenomenon that we as teachers, I think sometimes we have to live with the fact that students don't always recognize what we're trying to teach them until later in life. It's interesting. Okay, another question was, how can we decrease bad stress before performance?
Oh.
That's a tough one, yeah.
Didn't write that book.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
How can we reduce stress? Well, I think a lot of stress, and I speak for myself here, when I get nervous about playing, it's probably because I'm expecting too much of myself. I only expect a mere perfection, you know. Isn't that what we all do? We can't. We simply can't. To do as well as we can is okay. And again, it's not about you, it's about the music, and it's about connecting it to the audience, to the listener. And so that becomes the goal. And then suddenly you're not under so much pressure, I think. Hope that helps.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah. It's always about the music. It's not about you, right? Yeah. Okay, Steve said, for me, Bob's strength, either as a teacher or a performer, was his empathy. And he found that clearly as a freshman at Oberlin. He performed with you many years later in New Orleans and always found your empathy with others helped him and others to play their best.
Oh, that's very nice. Yeah. That's Steve Cohen, who taught for many years at Northwestern as the lead teacher of clarinet. And he was a double major when we were together at Oberlin. Steve was also in Mr. Dannenberg's studio. He, I think, was a year behind me. And thank you, Steve, for thinking that. Our time in New Orleans, he was at that time playing principal clarinet with the New Orleans Symphony. And I had my first teaching job. It was at Tulane. And I started a series there of chamber music. Every Wednesday at midday at noon, we had a 40, 50-minute chamber music program. So that was where I really started being the entrepreneur. Steve and his wife Annie was a cellist. We played the Brahms clarinet trio together, for example, and it was my very first time of ever playing a piece. I think your empathy, what you say was empathy, Steve, was actually just ignorance on my part. I was looking for you to show me the way to play this piece, which I remember having a lovely conversation about what was the tempo of that third movement. It was a very tricky one. Should it be faster? Should it be slower? I don't remember what we ended up deciding, but it was a fun conversation. But that was a great way to learn a lot of literature. And again, it was a great way to build an audience. It was in a little chapel on the Tulane campus and people could simply walk out of the buildings and come in and sit down for half an hour,
Sure.
45 minutes, and hear some music.
Yeah. Well, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have to have a resident campus. So
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
it can't be done at a junior college.
Sure. Yeah. Well, here's a question by somebody that we both know, Regina.
Oh.
Yes, Regina's here in Kansas City. Regina just said, I would like to say how much she enjoyed being your student and my student. Well, thank you, Regina, for both of us. What would be one piece of advice you would give to relatively new piano faculty in the collegiate setting as you reflect on your own experience? That's a hard one.
And not easy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think if I look back on my own career and what did I do wrong, it was to be too available. To say yes to too many things. Because if you say yes to one thing, you're going to get asked to do another thing too. And that quickly snowballs into a very difficult life. So don't be afraid to say no. That would be my advice.
That's a great piece of advice. But then sometimes you get asked to do things like this, which is just a pleasure. And so then you say yes, of course.
Oh, thank you.
But, I think it's a good question. And I wonder what you think about this because, I've been teaching in higher ed for now 7 years or so. And I think when I think about that question, for me, it's to take the time, instead of saying yes to everything, but to actually take the time to step back once in a while and say, what are my skill sets that make me really unique from others? And how can I really focus on doing that instead of just trying to do what everybody else expects or wants me to do?
That's great.
Sometimes I think that extra self-reflection is worth it. It's kind of, I always think of it as like the first thing we want to do when we learn a new piece is sit at the piano and start playing. But sometimes that score study of 15 or 20 minutes goes a long way to just sit back and take a more reflective approach.
Yeah, very true.
And maybe our careers are like that as well.
Good point.
But here's another question. Had a connection when you talked about stress before playing. Oh, she had a bad connection when you talked about stress before playing. Could you just repeat your answer? Yeah.
Oh, God, now I have to remember what I said. It had to do with when you are playing, you of course want to be perfect, and you can't be. You just can't be. You have to give up perfection. Then the other thing is to think that it really isn't about you. It's about the music you're playing, and it's about the audience and their enjoyment. And you can say that presenting yourself before an audience is already difficult. It is, can be. How much do you like people? You have to imagine that the audience are your friends, and that you're sharing this thing with them that is unique and beautiful. So you're presenting a gift of beauty, not a bundle of nerves.
Yeah. That's a great quote. A gift of beauty, not a bundle of nerves. See, and it's just like playing in public. Usually, the second time is better than the first, right? Yeah, that's a great answer. Well, okay. So, reminder: we have about 9 minutes left, but there's the link to the book in the chat, and there's the 20% discount code. So feel free to. There it is again. It's like magic. It just appears when you say it, right? So. Any other questions? Here's another one that came in, but feel free to be typing questions. Okay, Catherine again says, I believe you said that setting expectations that are too high causes the stress.
Right. Yeah, thank you for remembering, Catherine.
Yeah. Well, I guess, so keep typing questions, but we have about 8 minutes left. I guess, is there anything that we didn't cover in this book that you feel like you'd like to share with us, or just big picture kind of reflections?
Well, I'm not sure that I can think of anything right off.
Yeah.
Writing the book or putting the book together, I ended up gaining an appreciation of the aging process. I don't think of myself as an old person, but I am older than I used to be. And I started writing these things when I was 34. And That's pretty young. I mean, how old are you?
I'm 35.
You're 35. All right.
Yeah.
And the nice thing about it has been a sense that there really was a line from that early day till now that I can feel good about. It's just an acceptance of myself. I like you, who have been asking me the questions of stress, I put a lot of demands on myself. And I never measure up to what I would like to do or be able to do. But looking back over these many columns written at many different times, I can kind of feel a little bit of pride. So that's been a nice feeling.
It strikes me, one thing I said about, the career and sort of taking that time to step back and reflect on what makes you unique. It seems to me that you're doing that now after your career in an intentional way. You're putting all of these together and you're taking that step back and you're saying, you're finding a thread for yourself, which it seems like is very gratifying for you. And so, yeah, it's sort of the same theme. Maybe you should do that early in your career. Maybe it's worth it to take the time to think about it afterwards.
Right. And the whole idea of putting it into a book is so that other people can also follow that line and ask themselves, is this important to you? Is this important to me? It's a record of thought, this book, that may or may not, I would hope may, appeal to many of you, and that you will find joy in reading it.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great point because, in our conversations, we've talked about musicians that have read it, but you've also told me about some non-musicians that have read this book and have really enjoyed it as well. Right. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Or? Well,
the whole idea of practice, not practicing your scales, but the practice of living, the practice of law, the practice of medicine, the practice of teaching. It's a much broader thing. And, when Bach wrote the Klavierübung, that German word Übung means practice. And it's really easy to think of, I have to practice these pieces in order to play them. But I don't think that's the idea. I think it's really the practice of keyboard or of music. And so in the most general way, the book addresses that, I think. Yeah,
no, I think that's great. There's another question from Jill, actually, which is great. And then, we're running close to our deadline. So Jill said, after the book was published, did you think of any topic or recollection that you wish you had included? That's a good use of the title there, Jill.
Yeah. Well, there were columns that I didn't put in, but usually for a good reason. They weren't that good, or they didn't really appeal to me to add to this collection of subjects. So no, there wasn't really anything I didn't include.
Yeah.
And Paul Hersey's an old student.
Oh, very good.
A good friend.
Well, Paul, former student, said he really enjoyed the autobiographical sections, especially of your childhood and early experiences with the piano.
Yeah. The book starts there. I didn't know how in the world. Starting a book is not an easy thing, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
So how do you start? Well, you start at the beginning, and I talked about what it felt like as a 6-year-old to address the piano the first times, and so there's a personal story there, definitely, and we all have personal stories.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. In some ways, Jeremy Denk just had his memoir come out, and he started at the beginning too. And in some ways, the books are similar, I think, having read them both. I think they're very personal, but, very intimate. I mean, you're letting people into your life as an early musician, how you think about music. I mean, he does parts where he talks about specific pieces, and you have the essays on specific composers that we didn't have time to talk about today, but they're fascinating. So, I think there's a lot of parallels there.
Yeah, Jeremy's book I love that book too. Mm-hmm. Jeremy is famous. I am not. That's where there's a difference.
Yeah, well, but both have equally valuable insights, I think. Having read them both. So, okay, that was Jill again. Well, any other questions? We only have 2 minutes left, so Maybe we have time for one more quick question. And again, the link to purchase is in the chat with the discount code.
I wonder if we missed
And
any.
did we miss any? That's a great question. They were coming through.
No, I think we got them all.
We got them all. Okay, great. Well, Bob, this has just been a delight
Thank
to
you.
talk to you this morning. Yeah. And thank you for sharing all of your essays as well as interspersing it with new material.
Thank you. And you liked the coffee. That was very good.
I did like that. Thank you for the coffee as well. Well, it's just been such a delight to do this. I mean, we really do live 15 minutes apart, so there's no reason not to do it in person.
Right.
So,
Right. Well, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
yes, thank you to the Francis Clark Center for organizing this, and thank you for tuning in this morning. Okay.
Yeah, good.
I guess we
Do
can.
we turn ourselves off, or how do we do this?
I think, yeah. We can do